And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is August the 12th. Only 141 days remain to the year's over with. It's a major total solar eclipse. It's crossing parts of Greenland and Iceland and northern Spain. And there's partial visibility across parts of the northern hemisphere. Also, tonight starts the peak of the Perseid meteor shower. The totality paths across Greenland and western Iceland and northern Spain lasts up to 2 minutes and 18 seconds. Live video streams are hosted by organizations like NASA. And tonight, of course, as I said, is the Perseid meteor shower peak. A new moon provides the dark skies ideal for viewing up to 100 meteors per hour if you get away from the city lights. And it is a number of interesting things on this particular date. Crayfish Party, National Fishing Month, Afternoon Tea Week, the Puck Fair, Navasard, National Bargain Hunting Week. And let us see what stories we have in the news. We do live in interesting times. There's no question about that. Well, the progressive insurgency is having issues. Democrats' left-center battle intensifies as Shut It Down Schumer takes another hit, and it's been a split decision for President Trump. For the second straight week, the progressive left wing won a high-stakes Senate primary battle over the establishment in what is seen as the setback for longtime Democratic Senate leader Senator Shut It Down Schumer. But the biggest ballot box face-off between the far left and the center in the ongoing fight for the ideological future of the Democratic Party ended with a narrow victory for the establishment. Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley defeated Democratic Socialist State Representative Francesca Hong in Wisconsin's gubernatorial primary. Meanwhile, the Democrats' generational showdown claimed another longtime member of Congress. And it was a split decision for President Trump's endorsements in statewide Republican nomination contests as Minnesota, Wisconsin, Connecticut, Vermont, South Carolina, and Alabama held primaries yesterday. According to gubernatorial candidate, State Representative Francesca Hong, she told her supporters, "I know we don't have the final results right now, but I do know we're ready to keep fighting." I'm not sure what they're fighting for. They seem to be doing their dead level best to destroy this country as it has been for so many years. Hong, who's a former sheriff and single parent, is a Democratic Socialist of America member. Nearly lost to Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley. He consolidated support from more mainstream Democrats, was backed by retiring Democrat Governor Tony Evers. Crowley's going to face Representative Tom Tiffany, who cruised to the GOP nomination. Tiffany's a hard-right member of the conservative House Freedom Caucus who was backed by President Trump in the primary. General election winner will succeed Democratic Governor Tony Evers, who decided against seeking a third term in office. Politics has become a very nasty business these days. Well, the FBI touts 6,000 arrests, 44% homicide drop 1 year into Trump's D.C. crime crackdown. The FBI Tuesday marked the first anniversary of the Trump administration's crime crackdown in Washington, touting thousands of arrests and seizures since the enhanced federal enforcement effort began. The milestone comes 1 year after President Trump launched a Safe and Beautiful initiative for Washington, increasing the federal law enforcement presence and deploying hundreds of federal agents and National Guard troops to fight crime in the nation's capital. Well, it's having quite an effect, according to FBI Director Kash Patel. Then 1 year after it started, the FBI has worked with partners to make over 6,000 arrests, 2,000 drug seizures, over 1,300 illegal firearm seizures. Homicides in D.C. are down an incredible 44% from last year. FBI said the enforcement effort has resulted in 6,121 arrests, 237 search warrants, and recovery of $252,592 in cash. And he said the federal enforcement effort's going to continue. South Carolina GOP Senate showdown heads to a runoff in a race to succeed Lindsey Graham. The appointed Senator Darlene Graham and Representative Ralph Norman have advanced to a runoff election in the special Republican Senate primary in South Carolina, according to the Associated Press. The race is to succeed the late Senator Lindsey Graham. With no candidate getting over 50% of the vote, Graham and Norman will face off in a runoff in 2 weeks. Representative Russell Fry and former governor and former Representative Mark Sanford, as well as other contenders, fell short in Tuesday's primary, which was held 1 month to the day after the late longtime senator suddenly died at the age of 71. That's part of the problem. So many of our elected officials, once they got elected, have just stayed long past their sell-by date. Well, a failed presidential candidate has won the Democratic primary for Midwest governor amid fraud scandal fallout. Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat of Minnesota, has won the Democratic nomination for the governor of Minnesota. She continues her bid to replace longtime outgoing Governor Tim Walz, who dropped out of his re-election bid in the midst of a massive fraud scandal. Klobuchar, Minnesota's senior U.S. senator and a former Democratic presidential candidate, defeated a field of long-shot challengers in Tuesday's Democratic Farmer and Labor Party primary. She'll move on to face the winner of the crowded GOP primary in November. Walz announced earlier this year he was going to seek another term as governor as his administration faced intense criticism over its handling of the fraud involving Minnesota government programs that federal prosecutors say could end up costing the taxpayers over $9 billion in taxpayer funds. Let him go screw up something else. Democrats take a sixth shot at ousting popular GOP governor who voted for Harris. Democrats in deep blue Vermont have a new nominee as they take a sixth straight shot at trying to oust popular Republican Governor Phil Scott. Democrats in Vermont have a new nominee as they take their sixth shot as trying to oust Phil Scott. Economist Amanda Janu on Tuesday defeated former child advocacy organization CEO Allie Richards, who's backed by former Democratic governors Howard Dean and Madeline Kunin, to capture the party's gubernatorial nomination, according to the Associated Press. Scott was unopposed as he cruised to the GOP gubernatorial nomination. He's running for a sixth two-year term, steering Vermont. And if he wins the general election, completes another term, he'll pass Dean as the northern New England state's longest-serving governor. Vermont and neighboring New Hampshire are the only two states in the nation to elect governors every 2 years, which is a good thing if you got an incompetent governor, but if you got a good one, it's a bad thing. Scott's a moderate Republican and a vocal GOP critic of President Trump. I wonder who elected officials are going to hate when President Trump is no longer president. The governor endorsed former ambassador and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley in the 2024 Republican presidential primaries, voted for then Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee, over Trump in that year's general election. Beating Scott in November once again be a tough task for Democrats in a state where their party normally dominates elections. Scott won 73% of the vote in his 2024 re-election, best in the 69% he received in his 2022 victory. Very popular individual. Well, the Fever coach Stephanie White launches a fiery defense of herself after the Sophie Cunningham hit. When Chicago Sky Guard DeJono Carrington hit Sophie Cunningham on Saturday, pundits predictably turned on Cunningham. Meanwhile, Fever coach Stephanie White stayed quiet. White has stayed similarly quiet when Caitlin Clark has absorbed physical hits and media fire. Heading into Tuesday's game against the New York Liberty, White took the podium and suddenly found plenty to say. She said, this isn't necessarily for those people who are in this room or an online community that's trying to create narratives that simply don't exist, trying to create a fabrication or a distortion of who I am or what I'm about. Our players' success, our players' health and wellness, our players' safety is always a top priority for me. One of the things I pride myself on is my relationship with the players. And White brushed off criticism as a fabricated narrative about Cunningham. Cunningham absorbed the heat. Then came her explanation. And those who have anything to say about the play in the last game, I didn't see that play in real time. I went straight to a press conference. I thought the play got called right. Thankfully, Sophie's okay. Was it egregious? Absolutely. When you have a chance to watch it over and over on replay, you can see that. I didn't have that in real time. Missing the hit live explained Saturday night doesn't explain the silence that followed. Well, the interaction between a lot of the players is certainly egregious. Well, the next New Jersey mayor and her husband have been charged for using fake ballot signatures after she pleaded guilty to a DUI. Former New Jersey mayor who previously pleaded guilty to a DUI case involving her child is now facing new charges alongside her husband after prosecutors alleged false signatures appeared on her nominating petition for a Democratic primary race. Gina LaPlace, the former mayor of Lumberton Township, who remains a member of the township committee, was charged with making a false statement under oath, knowingly filing a false petition, tampering with public records, and falsifying or tampering with records, according to Burlington County Prosecutor's Office on Tuesday. LaPlace's husband, Jason Carty, was also charged with knowingly filing a false petition, tampering with public records, and falsifying or tampering with records. The petition submitted by Carty to the Lumberton Township Municipal Clerk for the primary election included an affidavit signed by LaPlace's La Placa, saying she personally circulated a petition and that such petition was signed by each of the signers thereof of his or her own handwriting. An investigation found that La Placa, 47, and Carty, 49, had collected signatures for the petition. Prosecutors said without the allegedly fraudulent signatures, La Placa's petition wouldn't have contained enough valid signatures to qualify her as a candidate for the June 2026 Democratic primary for Lumberton Township Committee. Well, more and more, we're seeing the Democrats guilty of fraud in elections. Well, the Office star Lucy Davis is at peace with incurable cancer diagnosis after nearly ignoring a warning sign. Lucy Davis revealed a devastating stage 4 breast cancer diagnosis after quietly battling that disease for the past year and a half. The Office actress said the cancer had metastasized to her spine, right hip, and ribs, and now incurable with chemotherapy no longer an option. She said the initial lump that I felt wasn't a lump as such, rather a kind of hard spot, really tiny, she said on Instagram. Almost didn't bother getting it checked, so I guess I'm saying don't ignore anything, get everything checked out. And rather than dwell on her progress, she said she was determined to embrace whatever time she had left. As of now, she said, I'm trying to live out whatever might be left of my life as fun a way as I possibly can. I always like to find the teachable moments in anything negative that happened, and cancer is not disappointed in that regard. There's a lot I've learned from it, and I'm grateful for that. She said maintaining that outlook hadn't made the physical realities of cancer any easier. But into every life a little rain must fall. Well, Pat McAfee attends a sporting event with President Trump wearing jeans and a backward cap. President Donald Trump, without a doubt, the most sports-minded president in recent memories in Ohio on Tuesday night for the culmination of the 2026 Patriots game, and he brought Pat McAfee in tow. So the most beloved and most hated politician in the country and the most beloved and most hated sports personality in the country hung out Tuesday evening. McAfee, the former NFL punter and prolific ESPN personality, sports show host, and soon-to-be highest-paid employee, met Air Force One who had landed in the Midwest. He was wearing a baseball cap, wearing it backward. He was meeting the most powerful man on the planet, and he wore jeans, a T-shirt, sneakers, and a backwards cap to the meeting. Trump got off the plane and stepped into a consistent rain shower, held his umbrella with one hand and pointed at McAfee with the other. And McAfee stood in the rain and pointed at Trump. That's a game-recognizing game, I guess you could say. Well, Bank of America unveils a $250 billion initiative to modernize the U.S. infrastructure. 18-month effort will target data centers, power chips, and transportation. Bank of America is launching, as I said, a $250 billion initiative to finance a broad build-out of U.S. infrastructure, including the data centers and semiconductor facilities and power generation and transportation projects. Banking giant announced Wednesday its critical infrastructure finance initiative will mobilize and deploy $250 billion through lending and investments in capital markets and advisory transactions over an 18-month period. It's going to end July 4, 2027. The effort comes as growing demand for computing power and electricity and manufacturing capacity and diversified supply chains drives infrastructure investment across the U.S. Bank of America said the initiative will focus on projects that strengthen energy and security and technological leadership and long-term economic growth. We'll see if it's going to be as successful as everybody thinks it will. Well, 5 teen friends were killed after a vehicle plunges down the Colorado cliff, leaves the community shattered. 5 17-year-old friends were killed when their vehicle went off a cliff and down a steep Colorado hillside, leaving their families and community grappling with unimaginable loss just as a new school year begins. The 5 boys, all from Grand Junction, were traveling along Lookout Lane late Saturday when their vehicle veered off the roadway and went down a steep incline. 3 of the teenagers, including the driver and front seat passenger, were wearing seatbelts. The other 2 weren't buckled in, were ejected from the vehicle, according to the Mesa County Coroner's Office. All 5 died from injuries sustained in the crash. Authorities weren't alerted to the wreck till about 7:45 on Sunday morning when 911 dispatchers got a report that the vehicle may have gone over the edge of a cliff, according to the Grand Junction Police Department. Police and firefighters responded to the area, discovered the wrecked vehicle along the hillside. Speed's being investigated as a possible factor, according to police. Authorities have not publicly identified the driver or said what caused the vehicle to leave the roadway. Coroner's office said it wouldn't release the teenagers' names because of its policy against publicly identifying minors. But it's basically an open secret there in town. Well, a Costco employee fatally rammed a car into a co-worker on a motorcycle after seeing a hug, according to the DA. Costco employee in Seattle suburb allegedly rammed his car into a co-worker riding a motorcycle. Killed him out of anger and jealousy, according to reports citing statements made to investigators. Tyler Sorensen, 22, is charged with second-degree murder in connection with the July 31st death of 20-year-old Jonathan Langdon in Issaquah. Sorensen allegedly followed Langdon out of a Costco parking lot before swerving into his lane and striking his motorcycle, according to court documents. Langdon was thrown from his motorcycle into a metal signpost, according to authorities. Sorensen fled the scene, but came back an hour later with a family member to speak with investigators, according to the Issaquah Police Department. Sorensen told his father he did something stupid, been in a collision, but kept going. Once his father realized Sorensen had left the scene of an accident, he drove his son back to the collision site an hour after the incident happened. Sorensen allegedly told investigators he became jealous after seeing Langdon hug a female co-worker who Sorensen claimed was his girlfriend. And after seeing that hug, he texted friends that his blood is boiling. And the end result is what's probably going to be a murder charge. Well, Russia is helping China close the gap with U.S. forces amid Taiwan tensions. That's according to a longtime military leader. Sound alarms are blaring over an escalating partnership between Russia and China to subvert the U.S. military amid rising hostility between the world powers. Retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery told Fox News that Moscow may be providing Beijing with technology to make its submarines harder for the U.S. Navy to detect, potentially eroding a key military advantage in the tensions over Taiwan. According to what he told Fox News, Russia is giving incredibly important technology to China, allegedly giving them submarine fighting technology, according to Montgomery, who co-authored a new book, Axis of Aggressors. Well, before we move to our topic for today, something came to light yesterday. You know, there's a big kick moving to more healthy foods and talking about moving to avocado oil and potato chips and things like that. And it came to light that a lot of the advances in healthy food were developed by smaller companies, were bought out by some of the majors. And the majors, for their part, instead of continuing the healthy move, had gone to cheaper products, which calls into question the lot of products we take for granted. I suggest you go online and check out the health of some of the foods that we eat. My wife, who is a dietitian, has been putting together a lot of that material. Might even have enough for a book, because we have published over 140 books so far. Well, we've been talking about UFO mysteries. Yesterday we talked about what's being referred to as terror from the sky. Stories about the MIBs, or the men in black. You know, a lot of the information on these topics actually came from privately printed books, because the main publishers don't seem to want to put out that type of information. They don't think it's sellable. And the most of the information, the initial information on the men in black, came from Albert Bender, director of the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He had what's being referred to as the first modern experience with these mysterious entities. He wrote a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers in 1956. But John Keel, who's an author who I love the way his books are put together, he widely publicized the men in black in his books and magazines in the 60s. I discovered him by accident when I was forced by my mother to go on a shopping trip to a department store. And while she was raiding the aisles, I was wandering around sheer boredom, and they had a section of books. And among those books were several by John Keel. The one that comes to mind is Our Haunted Planet, which was a fascinating book. Opened up a lot of doors into investigations I'm still following today. Keel's reporting showed that MIBs represent a much more complex phenomena than had been earlier suggested. Although people usually refer to the MIBs as the three men in black, actually there have been very few cases of them operating as threesomes. They don't always wear black. Sometimes even show up wearing military uniforms. Though they'll change the rank of the name that they use. There might be a Sergeant Peterson at the local base, and they'll show up at a UFO investigator's house as a Captain Peterson. And another surprising thing, although they're deeds are said to be dark. They've been incredibly popular with readers. And there've been a lot of folks want more information on these mysterious individuals. Well, there's been a lot of news stories as well. The story out of England from the Coventry Evening Telegram, dated March 12, 1968. Headline was Frightened UFO Man Gives Up and Warns in Others. According to that story, Mr. Brian Andrews shut down his UFO Information Bureau, and is certainly a frightened man. Since he opened the bureau in Coventry in September, he says he's been watched by a man with a glowing orange face. Had his telephone cut off whenever he tried to talk about UFOs. Got a phone message from a caller speaking unusual English and been worried by sudden fluctuations in the lights of a house he was visiting. He said, based on this harassment, I've given up, destroyed all my papers. There have been happenings that have worried me and frightened my wife. He said that the incident started in the beginning of October in 1967. At that time, he was repairing a car at the back of his mother's house. He said, I looked up and noticed a man standing by the next door garage. Nobody had been there before. His face was glowing orange, and as I watched, the face changed to that of an old man. He turned and walked away. You couldn't describe the first face in normal terms. It had eyes, nose, and the mouth in proper places, but not the shape that we associate with a human figure. And then shortly after that, the unusual phone calls started. The speaker seemed extremely knowledgeable about the topic and asked very searching questions about UFOs. And what was odd, he spoke textbook English without any slang or everyday words. And throughout the period of his investigation of UFOs, he said he had mysterious trouble with his telephone. Every time he was on the phone, tried to talk to somebody about the subject, the phone would go dead. All the lights in the house would dim. Now, this will happen every once in a while normally, but it kept on happening. And he said, since I've given up my investigations, I don't have any trouble at all. Well, Andrews is an electrical engineer. He's warning anybody against getting interested in this subject. He said, all this started 2 days after I opened up my Flying Saucer Bureau. And I want to publicly warn folks, this is nothing to dabble in. Well, the next story began January 17, 1977. It had very little to do with UFOs. A small group of formally dressed people on Hollywood Boulevard contrasted bizarrely with the noise and confusion of the rush hour traffic. Like a graveside ceremony, the observants honored the dead. The late Max Steiner, movie composer whose lush romantic background scores thrilled people for 2 generations. His memory is still perpetuated by thousands of movie buffs. And a bespectacled man stood beside the wood of Steiner under a big black umbrella held by an assistant. There was an unusual drizzle that had threatened all afternoon and finally cut loose. As workmen cemented the huge metal star bearing the composer's name onto the sidewalk, Albert K. Bender was there. That's a well-known name in the UFO field. And that Hollywood star was joining the stars honoring Clark Gable and Jean Harlow and James Dean and a lot of other deceased movie guests. There were teenage hecklers, of course, following an ape-suited man promoting the new King Kong film. But at that point, the teenage hecklers gave up chasing the ape-suited man and attached themselves to the Steiner speaker. Although Steiner may have become more famous for his Gone with the Wind score, he'd also written the mysterious, threatening music that accompanied the original King Kong, which was released in 1933. Paramount Pictures, purveyor of the remake of the film, had not sent a representative, although invited, to honored the composer for the former film, which rankled critics who insisted on comparing the new picture with the old classic. And I've seen both, and quite frankly, I do like the original. But Bender ignored the heckling and continued speaking, even though further annoyed by a new disturbing influence. A wild-eyed preacher set up his pulpit on the bed of a truck half a block away and shouted through a handheld amplifying microphone. He rallied about the destruction of Los Angeles during a predicted earthquake that would devastate the entire West Coast. In his ranting, the speaker connected the catastrophe with UFOs and quoted from the book of Ezekiel, repeating the prophet's vision of wheels within wheels and extraterrestrial visitors who turned not as they went. Well, during this time frame, especially when Bender was present, there were a lot of strange occurrences. And during this speech, he tried to ignore the distractions. He secretly remembered the dark days of his own UFO involvement, his flight from Bridgeport, Connecticut to Los Angeles after 3 threatening men knocked on his door. That gave rise to what became known as the Men in Black. Heeding their warning, he dropped out of UFO research and turned to another interest, fostered a revival of movie music in danger of being forgotten or lost. Started digging through studio archives and rescued and re-recorded crumbling music soundtracks recorded on decomposing nitrate films. And thanks primarily to his efforts, several releases of the old scores have become solid commercial successes on hit albums. But still, his UFO past dogged him as researchers tried to contact him to find out what he knew that resulted in his going silent. For that reason, he maintained an unlisted phone number, could only be reached at a box number, and waived any credit on album jackets. As that ceremony he was at ended, and he walked toward the waiting limousine, a huge bale of tabloids thrown from a news distributor truck almost hit him. The headlines were appropriate. Strange UFO abduction. There had been a time when he would have cut the wire binding those tabloids and thrown down some money and read the UFO story. But now he made it a point to ignore anything and everything to do with UFOs. Kept his face expressionless. Followed his wife Betty, ducking into the door held by the attendant. And they drove away. So at this point, you have to ask yourself, what does Albert K. Bender have to do with the UFO mystery and the probable role of intelligence agents in discouraging private UFO research? And why does he now refuse to talk about the subject after being one of the earliest and most vocal advocates of civilian investigations? Well, according to the story that came out, and Gray Barker was one of the main movements in getting this information out to the public. There came 3 men in black suits with threatening expressions on their faces. They'd walk in on you, make certain demands, and these men know that you know about what the saucers really are. They don't want you to tell anybody else what you do know. Well, the story of the 3 men set the stage for a report that would curdle the blood of saucer buffs all over the world. Now, Bender had started the International Flying Saucer Bureau, which became a major movement among civilian investigators. In fact, he was being inundated with requests to allow local chapters to be set up around the world. And suddenly, literally overnight, he put a stop to the whole thing. The really frightening aspect of the MIBs is maybe their unidentified status. They're not aliens in the sense of extraterrestrials. We could deal with those. They weren't government agents, though they might be from some secret government. Definitely a part of the saucer pattern. They warned people that knew too much to stop their investigation. They were terrifying because they were unknown. Bender might have known who they were, where they came from, but he wasn't talking anymore. And although his encounter with the MIBs are certainly not the first, he's the person who most closely identified with them when the silver saucer tales got spun. The case he reported wasn't only highly dramatic, but was publicized in 2 books. The first one was They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. Came out in 1956. The second one was Flying Saucers and the Three Men. Came out in 1963. In 1952, he formed a club he called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. Present-day UFO groups such as MUFON, or the Mutual UFO Network, and the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena were built after Bender's organizational structure. The prospectus mailed out by Bender promised the organization would collect and organize information and try to find out what the saucers were. Though the aim was to try and make friendly contact with the occupants if they ever landed publicly. Well, the Flying Saucer Bureau was highly successful in many of its aims, attracted an impressive list of members, and it eventually appeared as if Bender, through information gained by the help of the organization, was able to reach some firm and definitive conclusion about the origin and purpose of the flying saucers. And in came the MIBs. In February 1952, Bender set up a department for investigation for the purpose of investigating and evaluating sightings and photographs and other evidence received at his Bridgeport headquarters. And they published a quarterly journal of his activities called Space Review, which first appeared in October 1952. And during 1953, the publication hinted that a startling announcement would be published in the July issue. But that announcement never came. The October 1953 issue contained information, though, that was quite startling to most members. It announced that effective January 1st, 1954, the International Flying Saucer Bureau would be completely reorganized and would no longer be known by that name. And he offered refunds to all its members, although they could accept issues of another publication in exchange. New publication wouldn't be concerned with UFOs, but questions of the universe in general. Membership in a new organization would be restricted to specialists in particular fields, and the public would not be invited to join. A total about-face. But the most startling part of the Bender's final issue was some text on the front page. He said, "The mystery of the flying saucers is no longer a mystery. Source is already known, but any information about this is being withheld by orders from a higher source. Would like to print the full story in Space Review, but because of the nature of the information, we're sorry we have to be advised in the negative. We advise those engaged in saucer work to be very cautious in what they do." So he announced he had solved the UFO riddle and unleashed a mystery and controversy that had never been laid to rest. First indication that something unusual was happening in the Flying Saucer Bureau was a letter September 16, 1953. It advised those running all the various chapters to accept no more memberships until they had seen the October issue of Space Review. Well, there was a tape recording that made the rounds from a member of the Department of Investigations named Dominic Lucchese, or Lucchese, depending on your pronunciation, who said he just talked to Bender by telephone, and Bender had suddenly announced, "I know what the saucers are." And it was due to this knowledge and subsequent events that Bender decided to close the Flying Saucer Bureau and to drop the UFO subject altogether. So there became a frantic effort among all the members of the Department of Investigation of the now defunct organization to try and find out just what actually had happened. Piecing together telephone calls and 2 personal interviews with Bender, a fascinating story came to light. Now, it seems Bender had his idea of the origin and purpose of the saucers in mind for quite some time, but recently, though, he'd gotten proof consisting of diagrams and names. He wouldn't say what the diagrams were about or what the names were. Said he had submitted this information along with his own theory to some source, which he wouldn't disclose for consideration. Whether it's for confirmation or publication, nobody could find out. But it appeared the submission of that material led to the appearance of the 3 men in dark clothing came to his home unannounced. They had Bender's information with them and confirmed it was valid. And in addition, they offered further information and warned him against disclosing any of it. The confirmation of his theory and the presentation of the additional information seemed to be most upsetting to Bender. He said he was sick for 3 days after that meeting. And the person who visited him shortly after the alleged visit confirmed Bender seemed to be disturbed, not quite his usual self. Now, his silencing immediately became almost a fixation in the minds of a lot of folks. What Bender found out was a topic of discussion with all the friends who've been involved as members of the Flying Saucer Bureau. Nobody could understand what would make him want to drop out of the saucer scene. He was the top of a kind of thing he must have liked very much. He'd worked long and hard to set up the Flying Saucer Bureau, and it was the most popular UFO organization in the world at that point in time. And nothing in Bender's attitudes prior to the silencing indicated he might be getting tired of the work of running such a large club. Some skeptics did suggest that, but that turned out not to be the case. Well, after the best conclusion anybody could draw was his silencing as a result of interference by some government intelligence agency. And that theory is even more attractive today in light of recent exposures of excesses on the part of the intelligence community in political affairs. And since Bender, there have been murders of the Kennedys and King and suspicions of conspiracies and cover-ups in connection with them. And it is known today that during the 50s, the CIA was concerned about national security from Russian missile attacks, and agency convinced the Air Force that public belief in UFOs might cause confusion in case of an enemy attack. Now, why that would be is anybody's guess, but acting on that cue, the Air Force consistently played down sightings, tried to explain all of them as misinterpretations of natural phenomena or as hoaxes or hallucinations. Air Force tried to convince the public that the saucers were not real, and those who dealt with them were crackpots and lunatics. Well, such an agency could have frightened Bender by pretending to be some sort of super secret agents, maybe even representing the space people. They could have simply flashed official credentials and convinced him he was engaged in activities not in the interest of national security. It is conceivable they could have had something to hold over his head, maybe his job or even some skeleton in his closet nobody knew about. Bender didn't make a statement to the effect he could go to jail for an unlawfully long time if he revealed the secret he had discovered. Well, Gray Barker, who did a lot of research into Bender and what happened, had a lot of success with a book that was called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And he organized a small business called Saucerian Books to publish his own writings and the manuscript of others who couldn't get their experiences accepted by large publishing houses. And that's another interesting point. In the early days, those who wrote anything other than the accepted beliefs of the government officials found publication of their work very hard to achieve. His first title by Howard Menger was From Outer Space to You. And Menger was an interesting character. At that, after there was some success with Menger's book, Barker said he got in touch with Bender, using this fact as ammunition to encourage him to come out and reveal the secret. Everybody knew Bender enjoyed writing and liked to be, as most anybody else would, a real author between hardcovers. And Bender said he would actually write a book and would get to work on it right after the Christmas holidays. And then he arranged a meeting with Barker in January of '59 to discuss the book. Well, right before that meeting took place, Barker got a letter from Bender. It said, I began to write one chapter and something happened. As a result, I don't think this is the proper time to write about UFOs. Later said, I wish I could have written a book, but I feared for the safety of his wife and himself should he go ahead. And then in late 1961, Bender did another about face and told Barker he'd already finished the book. And when he gave the manuscript to Barker, Barker had the impression it was either a piece of fair science fiction or Bender had gone off his rocker. In light of today's more widespread acceptance of paranormal phenomena, the book's actually a little bit more believable. But it's the book, The Flying Saucer and the Three Men, which talked about some of the events that Bender experienced in regard to the three men in black. The most unbelievable events Bender reported began on March 15, 1953. The date had been set up as an experiment involving all Flying Saucer Bureau members who could participate. And on that date, members were to adhere to a timetable synchronized all over the world at 6 p.m. in the Eastern Standard Time Zone of the U.S., at which time everybody would concentrate and attempt to send a telepathic message to the UFO occupants. And the message to be relayed to the space people were welcome to land in peace and friendship. The Saucerians were to be urged to give some sign the message had been received. At the appointed time, Bender retired to his bedroom, turned off the lights, and laid down on the bed, began concentrating on the message. And as he began concentrating, a cold chill overcame his body. Dancing blue lights appeared in the room, and he smelled a sulfurous odor. He seemed to be floating 3 feet above the bed and could see his own body lying down on the bed. Then a strange voice filled the room, urging him to cease his UFO investigations and warned to make an appearance if you disobey. Well, that was only the beginning of the warnings he received, according to Bender. Later, 3 shadowy figures materialized inside his room and gave him a small metal disc, which they said would aid him in contacting them if he desired to do so. If he squeezed that disc and uttered the cryptic word Kazakh, it would reappear, particularly if he turned on his radio prior to doing so. That suggested to folks that the radio had something to do with their ability to materialize. Of course, a complete reading of Bender's unusual and frightening book is necessary for the reader's own evaluation. But until recently, that book was out of print, difficult to find in most libraries. And if you get a hard copy version, it's several $100s today. Well, to necessarily and maybe unfairly shorten a strange story, Bender became more deeply involved with his visitors and eventually was teleported to the South Pole, where a huge mothership and a smaller saucer-shaped craft provided a base for the visitors who had come here from a planet that was named Kazakh, were involved in extracting an unknown substance from seawater. Finished product looked like bullion cubes, and they took the time to tell Bender a lot about their home planet, where residents reproduced from eggs and occasionally were decimated when darkness and plague came on their planet. They had only a limited time to carry out their work while their planetary system was closest to the Earth and would soon be leaving. And their departure would be signaled by the disintegration of the contact disc they had given him. Then he was returned to his home safely again by teleportation. And as they had promised, one day, he said, that small disc crumbled to dust. Well, Bender did depart from his refusal of public publicity for a very short time, giving a few lectures and appearing on Long John Nebel's radio show on WOR in New York. But soon he again dropped out of contact with the saucer scene and moved to California, where he lived until his death. With an unlisted telephone and undisclosed street address, he could be reached only by mail at a box number revealed only a few friends. Well, Barker published his book with some disbelief and disappointment. At the time of publication, John Keel hadn't come along to crystallize much of the 4D theories that had been proposed by a few people back in the early days. Part of the problem, since the topic itself was somewhat unusual, some of the wild, outlandish theories that came to light just made it even more unusual. And people that ordinarily had paid attention turned their back on what they thought was unmitigated craziness. Well, the real facts about Bender's silence may never completely come out. Bender told a lot of stories to folks he considered his close friends. And Barker, in his writing, said he was fascinated by Bender's stories, although he didn't completely believe everything. He still can't help believing Bender's still hiding some very interesting secrets. And the first story, concerning 3 men in black suits that came to visit him, confirmed certain information, is still the most believable. When I was in California, I had several people tell me they'd had experiences with the MIBs. Of course, you never know if somebody was putting you on, if it really took place. And despite Bender's story of strange entities from the planet Kazakh, his real story might involve some government intelligence agents in something Bender found out, which he was forced to keep secret. Now, nobody really believes he completely invented the story as a cover for what actually happened or for his exit from the active UFO investigation. He worked too long and too hard to create the International Flying Saucer Bureau, and just throw it all aside would have taken some very convincing evidence, in my humble opinion. But what he reported was too similar to the paranormal experiences reported by many others who could have been involved with UFOs. Or it could have been a bit of lunacy. Whatever happened to him, Bender firmly established a fearsome tradition in ufological folklore. The stories of the men in black, later shortened by popular usage to MIBs. Like Coca-Cola, MIB became the Coke of a new generation of saucers. And folks would cast fearful glances over their shoulders and coming home alone at night, fearing they might be contacted because they knew too much. Although the publication of Bender's experiences created the first widespread interest in the men in black, apparent that those shadowy mystery visitors have been around for a long time. The man named Dennis Stamey, in a chapter that appeared in The Truth About the Men in Black, published by Current Glimser, believes visits by unknown agents are seeded throughout UFO literature and newspaper accounts of flying saucer sightings. For a lot of years are overlooked or not recognized for what they were. And today, just about every UFO investigator has encountered the men in black. History of demonology and witchcraft and the occult are filled with similar incidents, leading one to speculate the UFO phenomena are at least partly psychic in nature. UFO magazine editor Alan Greenfield pointed out that there's usually a consistent reference associating the term black man with the devil, along with a mention of an Indian-like appearance supposedly attributed to the devil by witches. Greenfield has noted there was a concentration of these cases beginning at the time of the Elizabethan post-Reformation era in the 1600s. Several cult volumes classify these beings into a group of their own and refer to them as men in black, demons, devils, apparitions, or black men, the later being the most commonly used. Writings of Archwitch hunter Cotton Mather mentioned the black man associated with the Indians. There was mention of a man dressed in black during the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts. Virginia Brasington wrote a book called Flying Saucers in the Bible, and she repeated what may well be folklore regarding the origins of the Great Seal of the U.S. According to this tradition, Thomas Jefferson was walking alone in his garden late one night when he was approached by a mysterious man wearing a flowing black cape, and that visitor handed him a parchment on which was described the basic design that became the official seal of this country. During the Great Airship Invasion of 1897-1898, a lot of mysterious visitors appeared, having oriental features, dark complexions, slight statures, and heavy, indefinable accents. They became a part of the strange legacy from the end of the last century. During one such instance, a huge dirigible dropped several artifacts over a small community in Texas. Local citizens gathered them and put them on view in a store window. Next day, a man posing as a traveling dealer came to the store and offered such a high price for the items, the storekeeper reluctantly sold the objects to him, and they disappeared. One of Barker's favorite modern MIB stories came out before his book. Although it's undocumented, it suggests that the shadowy visitors from outer space may have been meeting with high officials in the U.S. State Department. In 1956, shortly before they knew too much about flying saucers was published, Citadel Press brought out a second book by Dr. Morris K. Jessup, whose case for the UFOs it had published the previous year. The second volume, called the UFO Annual, is a compilation of UFO reports for the year 1955. Obviously was intended to be the first of an annual series, which never continued. It was a 375-page book, apparently hastily put together with newspaper clippings, letters to the author about his first book, other material largely published verbatim with little editorial comment or bridging references. And as a result of the poor organization and relatively high price, the book was bought only by serious UFO buffs and failed on the general market. Well, if you had a copy and you studied it carefully, you see some weird accounts about some strange men in black. The clipping in question had been inspired by the Bender story. First appeared in 1955, the year before Barker's book came out. It was an actual newspaper or magazine column. It appeared to be only one of such hastily gathered items Jessup reprinted. Identified only as appearing in David Grinnell's column, it was typical of all the sparingly documented material in the book. It was a frightening, almost charming little MIB story. Now the question becomes, how much of the MIB folklore was made up and how much actually happened? When you get off into the world of fantasy and make-believe, sometimes you convince yourself that things you came up with actually did happen. And in other instances, what happened was too unbelievable to even put down on paper. Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We're back tomorrow. Once again, you'll be listening to Ken Hudnall and the Ken Hudnall Show. One thing I do want to make mention of, lately, we've talked to a number of people who other disabled veterans like myself, who get up to the 70 or 80% disability rating, which is respectable in and of itself. And they can't seem to get any further. And I had one individual go on and on about the fact he had reached the pinnacle. He was at 100%. Nothing else to be gained. Well, that's not true. There's a second scale that starts above 100%. It's called special monthly compensation. And very few people seem to know anything about it. And the VA didn't really publicize it that much. But if you want to know about it, go to Amazon Kindle, look up Ken Hudnall. We've come out with a book about special monthly compensation, how to achieve it, and what it can do for you. Well, on that note, we'll be back tomorrow. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.